One down, 11 to go. This project took a lot out of me, and it didn't turn out the way I wanted it to. But there's a lot to talk about, so let's see what we have. When I realized modeling every asset was taking up more time than I was expecting it to, I decided to switch to making navigating the 3D environment the focus of the game as simply as I could. So I took the 3 zones, the beach, the park, and the city, and I planned on making a challenge for each of them. A sandcastle, a giant tree, and a rundown building. Put a pin in those last 2. I started with making the castle, which was pretty straightforward, but again, it took me longer than I expected it to. If you were curious why it takes me so long to make a 3D asset, the biggest bottleneck in my workflow was texturing. I wanted every square meter in the game to be textured by a 64 by 64 square of pixels exactly. When I started out, I was dragging vertices to as precise a location as I could before I learned that you could just type in exact pixel coordinates. This still required me to do math anytime I wasn't texturing an area that wasn't a perfect square meter by multiplying that distance in meters by 64 and then taking that number and blah blah blah. The point is that it was very tedious and time consuming. In the process of making the sandcastle, I realized that making a giant tree was impractical in the time limit, and climbing up anything was, at the time, very frustrating. We'll get back to that later. So I shifted again to do something that I thought would be simpler, a hedge maze.
Say the line!
Fish.
This took more time than I thought it would.
Yay!
But it was all manageable. I gave myself a day for each challenge, and each of them took about a day and a half. But it could have been a lot worse is the point. Another thing slowing me down was my insistence, at least at first, in making every face out of triangles. I had my reasons for doing it that way, and it worked out for smaller, simpler objects, but it caused problems when making the building, but I'm getting ahead of myself. In retrospect, it would have been better to make the faces out of whatever shape they happened to be, and I'm sure it would have worked out fine. With the hedge maze done, I decided to move on to the city. So far I had one challenge that focused on platforming, the second on spatial reasoning, so to close the loop, the final challenge should incorporate both elements. The plan was to make an old decrepit building with debris blocking the way and sections of floor missing, forcing the player to jump around and use unorthodox means to navigate, but unfortunately making a broken building is harder than copy-pasting one floor to the next, and weathered irregular textures are harder to make, so I compromised one last time and made a pristine, if inconveniently laid out, hotel-inspired building. This being a vertical challenge, it finally forced me to address a large issue I was ignoring. I was using Brackeys' 3D character controller that he made available on his channel. It's intended for prototyping 3D levels and not for full releases of games, so it isn't made for all situations. My intention was always to make my own 3D character controller, but, well, I've already used the Bart Simpson meme. I had to work with what I had. The biggest issue was not being able to climb up surfaces that visually looked like they should be climbable. Another was rocketing off of downhill slopes. I did find a video that solved both problems in a very robust and elegant way, but in the first minute of the video, they showed off a quick and dirty method using a node already in Godot that fixed the problem at the cost of causing the player to walk up any slope that wasn't at 90 degrees. So I took that node and I tweaked it by moving and rotating it into the player to stop the sandcastle from being completely trivialized. The solution worked for me only because I knew what all the surfaces in the game would be, and the game was small enough that I could just test all of them to make sure they worked the way I wanted them to and tweak things as necessary. For the downhill problem, I used a raycast that checks every frame if it's intersecting with the floor, and if we were on the floor of the previous frame, and not jumping, it would teleport the player to where the intersection was taking place, a less sophisticated version of the method found in the video I mentioned before. This is the only change I contributed to Brackeys' code that actually made it into the game. Yep. The next thing I worked on was the lighting. I genuinely feel like I could have spent the whole month just fiddling with the lighting and still not gotten it just right. As it stands, I had to call what I had good enough and move on to sounds. I had this idea to make a sound system that would follow the player in a defined area to keep the ambiance consistent in volume and direction, but had to settle for multiple players situated to cover the zones as they needed to, which worked out better than I expected it to. I got all the sounds I used in the game at freesounds.org and credited everyone whose work I borrowed in the README. The last thing I made were the stars that act as rewards for completing challenges. I wanted each prize to be themed to the zone that it's found in, but instead just leaned into the rush nature of things and made them the most cliched collectible just to get them all done. I made a simple code to have the star oscillate up and down and destroy itself on contact with the player. This is the only new script I made for the game. And that was that. I think the biggest lesson to take from this experience is the value of time management. While I was pushing myself to work as much as possible in the last few days, The first 2 weeks had a lot of procrastinating due to, honestly, anxiety. I haven't been very active as a developer, and I think it's primarily because of how much emotional weight I put on things I make. This challenge has been great for giving me a deadline and forcing me to focus on a single project. Having made something and posted it has taken a lot of the anxiety out of putting myself out there, which is kind of like exposure therapy. There's still a lot in the game I'm proud of, and some mechanics that worked out better than I expected. But enough about what has been made. Let's move on to the next game concept. Something 2D this time, so I can stop seeing vertices in my dreams. It's best practice to make games you want to play, and there's a game I've been wanting to play for a long time. A game that combines the structure of Pokemon, with combat inspired by Inscription and Magic the Gathering, with the aesthetics of Paper Mario. Encarnate. It is clearly too complex to make in a month. I have learned my lesson somewhat. Still, it's one of the games I'd really love to make one day, so having the ability to playtest it now would be really useful so I can refine the mechanics. With that in mind, I have a better game to take inspiration from. The 1998 game Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters for the Game Boy. I became curious about this game when I learned that the first ever Yu-Gi-Oh! Tournament in 1999 was actually played using it. It really tickles me that this came out the exact same year as Pokemon Blue and Green. While Pokemon had memorable characters, a coherent story arc, a functioning overworld, intuitive menu system, and balanced battles, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has, contextless duels with disconnected opponents where you just play the biggest card in your hand, and whenever you get a card as a prize, you have to remember its number and look it up to look at it. A perfect starting point to improve upon. I want to implement those time management lessons, and to facilitate that, I'll be changing my video schedule, potentially. Instead of making a video every 2 weeks, no matter what, I'll be making a video only when I feel like I'm at the polishing stage of development. When all the critical systems are up and running, and the main focus is making the game prettier and run better. This will avoid the issue of having nothing to show in the midpoint video and then having way too much to say in the wrap-up. That said, I'm still aiming to make a video on the 14th, meaning I have 11 days left at time of recording. I better get to work. I wish you all a wonderful day, and I'll see you when I see you.